Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Toope, and it's my great honor to serve as the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. Thanks for being patient. We were working out some gremlins behind the scenes, just tech problems. I hope all is well now. I'm delighted to welcome you to this Cambridge Conversation, the sixth in our series bringing you Cambridge ideas during the COVID-19 crisis. Welcome as well to our 30th annual Alumni Festival and our first ever conducted entirely online. It would, of course, have been lovely to see many of you here in Cambridge under other circumstances, but it's a wonderful thing to be able to hold this event through the magic of modern technology and to be able to accommodate larger audiences than ever before. During this session, your microphones and cameras will be turned off, but I hope that you will see and hear our speakers. After our conversation, there'll be around 25 minutes where our speakers will respond to your questions. You can submit a question at any point by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of the page you're watching and typing your question. Now, we're expecting there to be far more questions than we can actually answer, but we'll do our best to address as many as possible. This event is also being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel after the festival. As you know, the UK is home to a large number of castles, palaces, and stately homes, many dating back centuries. It can be a surprise to visitors to note that in some of the earliest of these buildings, rooms flow one after another without a separate corridor. In order to move from one room to another, you might pass through someone else's bedroom, even the reigning monarchs. Concepts of privacy, even among the ruling classes, were very different in the past. And of course, for the poor, then as now, whole families would live in one room. Our ideas of physical privacy have changed through the centuries, and we seem to have learned to value aspects of it highly. In the 20th century, the private lives of the famous were put up for sale by paparazzi with telephoto lenses, or by those purporting to be celebrities' friends. But today, in a digital age, when some celebrities market their own lifestyles as a personal brand, each and every one of us has personal information that's worth a price. Our personal data is littered across the internet. We leave a trail of intimate information, names, dates of birth, yes, but also our shopping habits, the food we like to cook, the books we read, the websites we follow, the places where we holiday, the music we listen to, the people we count as our friends. We record how and where we run or cycle, our heart rates, our weight, even the number of calories ingested in a day. We post our thoughts, including political opinions, and comment on those of others. This is all data that has a commercial value. When we sign onto a new website or mailing list, we're sent privacy options and asked to read long terms and conditions. How many of us do? Our shopping preferences or our travel destinations are useful to those who want to sell us more stuff. Knowing our thoughts on political issues can be useful to those making policy decisions or trying to understand how we will vote. But at a more sinister level, it's information that can be used to manipulate us into thinking or voting a certain way. In the past few months, many countries have instituted tracking and tracing apps that can be used to show where we've been and with whom we've met. It could help defeat the spread of a virus. But is this data protected? Do we wish to give it out? There are those who say they don't mind if their data is public. I have nothing to hide, they say. But what if the world changes? What if the personal thoughts and ideas that didn't seem to matter suddenly do? What if your private or not so private data renders you a target? Here to discuss the perilous nature of privacy are two leading experts, Dr. Kirsty Hughes and Dr. David Erdos. Kirsty is a university senior lecturer specializing in human rights and public law. She's a member of the Center of Public Law and a fellow at Clare College, where she's a director of studies. David is a university senior lecturer in law and open society and deputy director of the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Law and a Wing Fellow at Trinity Hall. Well, David and Kirsty, let's begin by thinking about privacy. I was saying that it seems to be something that most of us value very, very highly, and yet there's more information about us out there in the world than ever before. It also seems to be something where there are differences in perception from perhaps continent to continent or culture to culture. Let's first talk about the concept of privacy. Why is it important? Kirsty, why don't you begin maybe by giving us a sense of what you think privacy means?
Thank you very much for bringing up this conversation. You've done a really great job of picking out the scene in terms of explaining very much the complexity and the subjectivity which privacy raises. Because of this, privacy is quite difficult to find, precisely because of its subjective nature and because there have been private changes as well. What is private to you may very well be different from what is private to me. Information that's private to you may not be private to me. I may want personal space in contexts where it doesn't really matter to you. So we can't really necessarily identify clear-cut interests where we're going to universally agree that something is private or not private. But what I think is fairly universal is that we experience privacy when our barriers are respected. And those barriers may protect information, they may protect personal space, they may protect a realm of decision making by giving us this protected sphere. Consequently, although you might want to use those barriers in different contexts from me, we each encounter a loss of privacy when those barriers are breached, and we each encounter a loss of privacy when our opportunities to use barriers are eroded. So we need to think very carefully about measures that breach those barriers or jeopardize our capacity to erect them. Now, why is that important? Which I think was the other aspect of your question. Well, at its heart is freedom. It's about space to think, to try out ideas. And so it's very much connected on an individual level to autonomy and dignity. But we're often quite suspicious of privacy, this nothing to fear, nothing to hide argument that you suggested. And we sometimes regard privacy as rather trivial or even selfish, or people just being difficult. But clearly, privacy is important to society as well. I mean, it prevents the descent into totalitarianism. It gives us the space for the intellectual development of society. It enables to form different sorts of relationships. It facilitates equality. And it's really essential to trust. And so, in terms of thinking about what privacy is, I think privacy is about respect for barriers, and that it's important both for the individual, but also for us as a society as a whole.
Thanks, Kirsty. This concept of trust that you've put on the table does strike me as very important. And of course, that has all sorts of implications for how we understand information, access to information, protection of information. A lot of this now is digitized online. David, anything you want to add?
Yes, I think it would be helpful to sort of bring a bit of a historical perspective and then bring personal data protection into the picture. So I think it's fair to say that although, as Kirsty said, there's never been a common understanding of privacy, we would used to focus on intimate private life, very intimate facts, very maybe the home, people's personal lives narrowly conceived. But with the development of computers and networks and the internet eventually, it's been understood, I think, going back to the 1970s, that you need a much broader understanding of privacy, which has always been contested. Because, as I think the Council of Europe said back in the 70s, correlations of apparently innocuous data can lead to big effects and what seemed to be unreasonable effects on individuals. And really out of that has come data protection, which from the 1980s actually abandoned just saying it was about privacy to saying that it was about protecting all the rights and freedoms which could be impacted for the individual when their personal data was used. And when I say personal data, I do literally mean any information which identifies or renders someone identifiable. So very, very broad. And the sort of rights which are talked about were the sort of things which we're still talking about. So non-discrimination, rights to a fair trial and to fair treatment. I mean, that can take you back into contempt of court, but obviously on the internet, you know, that prejudicial communication is very common, let's put it that way. Rights to association, rights to work, even freedom of expression, which is in huge conflict as well with data protection. And in Europe, at least, and whether we retain this is going to be an interesting debate, data protection itself has been considered a fundamental right from the 2000s, and really out of the idea that our dignity and our control, our autonomy, Kirsty said, is under such profound threat that we really need comprehensive protection of personal information itself.
Kirsty, do you want to come in here just to tell us a little bit about how the protections that David's just talked about actually work, at least in the European context? A key element of this is the European Convention of Human Rights. How does that actually protect autonomy or seek to protect autonomy and other human rights that are relevant to the privacy debate?
Sure. Well, of course, the data protection legislation that David is referring to is obviously under the auspices of the European Union, and so the European Convention on Human Rights is under the Council of Europe. So that's relevant in terms of thinking about the longevity of these measures. But the European Convention on Human Rights is fundamental to privacy in Europe, and it's particularly fundamental to privacy in this jurisdiction. It was drafted in the post-war period. The UK was involved in that. And Article 8 of the Convention protects private life, family life, home, and correspondence. And it was vital because traditionally there was no right to privacy as such in English law. So the state was free to tap telephones, listening devices, to compel you to engage in a strip search without needing to have a legal framework in place. Equally, private actors had vast powers as well. So, I mean, we had cases where the paparazzi was storming hospital rooms and taking photographs and publishing them in national newspapers of famous actors, and the courts couldn't preclude them from doing so. And so Article 8 has been fundamental to a wide range of areas. It's enforced at the international level by the Strasbourg Court, but it also forms part of domestic law under the Human Rights Act 1998, which puts various obligations on public authorities and has implications for private actors as well. Of course, it's important to note, though, that the right to privacy is not absolute. It is a qualified right. So it doesn't mean that the state can't take measures which interfere with privacy. Of course, it can, but it has to have a legal framework in place. It has to be acting in accordance with a legitimate aim, which in many contexts could be national security, but public health and the rights of others are also legitimate aims. And the measure has to be necessary and proportionate to that.
Kirsty, just before I go back to David, could you give us a sense of what is the status of the European Convention that you've just described in a post-Brexit world for the United Kingdom? I'm sure there are people who are wondering that.
Sure. Well, because it is not EU legislation, it's not impacted directly by Brexit, although the European Convention on Human Rights has been controversial for some time. Certainly in some political quarters, there's been a wish to pull away from the ECHR. And one of the safeguards of the ECHR, of course, was always that it was part of being a member of Europe, even though it wasn't EU legislation as such. So it is more vulnerable, but it doesn't cease to have effect. We do still have international legal obligations for whatever they mean, obviously in our current political climate. But in principle, we have them. We also have them under domestic law with the Human Rights Act.
Great, thank you very much. David, I want to go back to talking about data protection and the interrelationship with privacy from the perspective of the private sector. I happen to have been reading a bit about this recently, and I'm reading a lot about something called surveillance capitalism. Tell me what that means, and what are the implications, ranging from small startups that have access to information. Dare I mention something like Cambridge Analytica, right up to very large companies like Google, Facebook, and the access to data that they have. How does privacy play out in that private space, so to speak?
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, you've mentioned the private sector in general, and obviously private sector usage of personal information is extremely diverse, and some of it remains very innocuous. I mean, if a sole trader, a newsagent needs to arrange the cleaning of their shop, then that could be personal data, but the gathering of it is innocuous. Sometimes it is sensitive, but its sensitivity is sort of outside that surveillance capitalism. So a lot of employment data is extremely sensitive. You might have health data, but it might also just be sensitive because of disciplinary matters or whatever else. But it's sort of things we've dealt with for a long time. But surveillance capitalism is really something which you can go back to sort of marketing lists and credit rating agencies, but it's something which has qualitatively changed as a result of online developments. And it's essentially the way in which we are profiled, we're tracked, and then we're targeted as well in terms of our decision making. And that might be just, what bar of soap to buy, but it might also, as we know from things like the Cambridge Analytica issues, it might also be trying to even influence our democracy itself. Primarily, it's developed as a result of a commercial motive, and it's for commercial reasons that it's being spread. And a lot of it is happening by companies which are primarily not even in Europe, let alone in the UK. And that poses challenges in terms of enforcement. About half the world does have data protection law, but nevertheless, it's very diverse. And Europe may well often say that the law applies and they shouldn't be transferring data outside Europe anyway without privately putting mechanisms in place to ensure protections continue to apply. But I think what you're getting at is also whether the basic model of what you've probably been reading about is compatible with data protection. And I think there are a lot of issues there. The law expects care, it expects a high degree of integrity and discipline, and it expects fairness and fair balancing. But it goes further. And in relation to sensitive contexts, sensitive collection, or even sensitive types of data, so you've mentioned political opinion, I've mentioned health, there's also religious belief, ethnicity, these sorts of things, but also collecting data directly from someone's devices, that's the context of collection. It really would expect freely given, specific and informed consent, or some other form of very clear and explicit waiver by the individual. Now, if in fact surveillance capitalism is a monetary, I said it was sort of primarily commercial motive, it's designed to commodify personal data, then this entire model is not really compatible with a lot of the assumptions that data protection is making about control and consent, and that being free. And the way in which it encourages as much data, obviously that's an exaggeration, but large amounts of data to be shared with large numbers of actors in the quickest way possible, in the way which can be used and manipulated for as long as possible in order to get that value. That also goes to the issues of integrity and care and everything else. But the danger, to be fair to the others, to those who would say there's more compatibility, you do also need trust. And if there's a decline in trust, then in a way the market will suffer as well. But they are some more fundamental tensions here. As I say, data protection, fundamental right, control, a fundamental right to strong protection is in tension with surveillance capitalism.
Thanks, Kirsty. I read a wonderful quote by the European Privacy Commissioner who said, "When you think you're searching Google, it's searching you." And obviously, she wasn't really singling out Google. It's a more general issue. What are the human rights implications of that kind of reality that David's just described?
The human rights implications of
That kind of very intrusive access to personal data without your knowledge necessarily. You may have formally consented to it through standard clauses, but people may not be fully aware. Are there human rights implications there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of human rights implications certainly under Article 8. I mean, they often look to data protection principles as well. So the two systems both operate in parallel, but also interface too. Human rights law, although we classically think of it as rights against the state, of course, has also expanded through positive obligations. So states now have obligations in relation to private actors. And of course, we also know that private actors and the state also work together on some of these issues. So things like surveillance, and that states benefit from the kinds of surveillance that private actors are engaged in. And that has been considered by the court, and they've also had to consider what legal frameworks are in place to address that. But of course, it's always playing catch up on these issues, because it's always, the technology is rolled out, and then it's always having to come after the event and try and see what can be done, so to speak.
Not surprisingly, there are lots of questions. So I'm going to move right now to questions from people who are online. The first one is interesting to me. A graduate of King's living here in the UK asks, should we be allowed anonymity on social media? And I think the question is really getting at probably some of the concerns that we have about incivility, badgering, hectoring, trolling, all of those kinds of issues. David, what's your sense? Would you protect anonymity on social media?
It's a great question, particularly as a big area I look at is the tension between freedom of expression and data protection. And there's actually quite a lot of European case law which would say that once you're impacting individuals by publishing data to the world, then you actually have these obligations that I talked about of fair treatment, balancing, integrity, discipline. And of course, that wouldn't actually be possible in practice if you were totally anonymous and you couldn't be tracked or traced. On the other hand, many people in the data protection privacy community strongly value anonymity and strongly oppose any idea of that being undermined. I mean, my own personal perspective, actually looking at the law, is that the law does expect, the law looks to see that somebody who can be located is genuinely responsible for harms that are impactful. And where the individual actually is going to be, even after notice, the only entity which is going to be, primarily responsible, then I think pseudo-anonymity is really what should be expected, in the sense that the real contact details are retained by the online service provider. And in fact, that in some ways is what the law says, without getting too much into the technicalities, is if an online service is genuinely saying that it is processing on behalf of another entity, then there is actually a requirement in the technicalities of the law. You could say it violates human rights. I'm sure some companies would like to argue that, but that you should collect the real contact details and name and address and have that available for legal process or regulatory process. Now, if a company wants to operate outside that and say, no, we want to actually really promote truly anonymous speech, then that is fair. I can see in some circumstances that could be valid, but then it needs to take responsibility as controller then if someone is coming to them with an issue, it can't say, well, primarily you have to go even at this stage to X, Y, or Z, because X,
Great.
Y,
I
and Z
just stopped you there, and I want to get Kirsty's sense on this. Do you share the same approach?
Well, I certainly think there are legitimate reasons for why people want to have anonymity when they're operating within the public sphere, and that is established as a state of privacy that we all potentially desire at certain points. And it's important also not for freedom of expression itself. I mean, obviously, in terms of participation. I think David's outlined well for us the safeguards that there needs to be in place. And obviously, in human rights law, it's always about checks and balances with other competing rights and interests. And so I think he's set out for us quite well how some of those may take place, distinguishing between different operators within the system.
Thank you. David referred to test and trace, and not surprisingly, we have some questions around testing in relation to COVID. We've got one question that really focuses on whether there are differences in different cultures that actually allow the culture to effectively deal with a situation like COVID in a way that cultures that value privacy more may have trouble with. So the comment was in Southeast Asia, there seems to have been greater ease in handling the outbreak. And the assertion is that maybe because there's less respect for privacy, more willingness to give up tracing data. Whereas here, there's a question about access to data from trace systems. And we seem to be having trouble pulling together systems, partly because of those concerns. Where do you sit on that, Kirsty?
Well, certainly there are cultural differences about privacy, and there's cultural differences in the types of measures that citizens are perhaps used to having imposed on them from their state. And so that would potentially cause differences in response. Having said that, there has also been concern in some of those jurisdictions as well about a reluctance to take up, to participate in the use of such measures as well. So I don't think it's perhaps necessarily clear cut that everybody's on board with it in one jurisdiction and they're not in another. But it has been very much reflected, I think, particularly here domestically, in the discussion between a centralized or decentralized approach to the app and looking at what's worked and hasn't worked in other jurisdictions as well.
Anything you'd want to add, David?
Yes, I mean, I'm reminded that I think fairly early on in the lockdown, it came to light that intimate data about particular relationships was actually being released by certain countries in Southeast Asia, probably inadvertently in terms of what the public authorities were releasing, and clearly that presumably may well, as Kirsty said, undermine trust and undermine the integrity of the aim of what is actually the app is trying to do, which is not about intruding per se in that way into someone's private life. I mean, I think it's certainly true that particularly for countries which should take a control focus on data protection rather than a protection focus. So I mean, to use a sort of word of paternalism, if you like, in inverted commas, if you take that being the primary aim of data protection, then maybe you can design systems which have high trust, high integrity, high discipline, and actually deliver things in a way where the public health can be delivered. If you take a very stringent, no, people have a right to freely given consent and they have a right to opt out, then yes, that culture can undermine public goods and it can undermine the fight against COVID. I think that's true.
So we have this whole issue of trust coming up again and again and again. We have a question that's a bit specific on that, and I don't know how much you will have studied the following particular situation, but we have a question from a person who's asking about control of patient information regulations in the UK, and the argument is that these regulations actually allow for fairly wide access to healthcare data to be shared, it's asserted, without consent. And the question is that a problem? Does it undermine, if the public were aware of that, would it undermine trust in allowing health data to be collected through the NHS and other systems? Do either of you feel comfortable in approaching that question? David?
Sure, yes. I mean, I think it's true that health data can be used in the way the questioner suggested, and that's, represents society's understanding that there is a strong public interest in health and in knowledge of how to fight diseases and how to improve public health. Now, the law is still quite stringent around things like data minimization, which would point to, at least, and it's a technical term, pseudo-anonymization, very strong encryption and keys to ensure that that data isn't actually, as far as possible, going to be identifiable, even if the data is lost, and that the research is designed in a way that doesn't impact individuals and doesn't, in that way, cause them damage, including distress. Now, I can see why people might feel, and we haven't got on to the issue of enforcement, that in fact there may be little appetite to really apply the law, to articulate what do you mean by minimization? Where is the balance there between the fact that people have to, as researchers, get on with the job, and that's incredibly important, but also have strong security and other protections? I can see why some people might have serious concerns there. But you get back, yes, to that fundamental model of whether you think that data protection is about ensuring against harms, and if that's in place and there's a strong public interest, that actually is the aim of data protection, to facilitate these forms of activity, or whether you take a control focus and you say, no, it's informational self-determination, and if the individual isn't happy, they should be able to opt out. If you take the second approach, then you will not like the UK law. I actually don't, for things like when it's the substantial public interest. I favour the first approach and actually think that the law is in principle in the right place.
Thank you. Kirsty, we have a question from a Corpus Christi graduate in the USA that's focusing on whether or not we could ever imagine universal and general principles for online privacy. Is that something that could be developed? This person is emphasizing that a lot of the questions arise with use of data by multinational corporations, and yet concepts of privacy, as we've already seen, have some cultural differences. Could we ever come up with a unified view that would be more comparable to what is described as our innate sense of privacy in the physical world?
Sure. Well, it's particularly interesting, I think, that this question has come from the US. I mean, I work with a lot of colleagues in the United States, and we're always trying to find shared ground and common principles on these matters. But we do have quite significant differences of opinion on privacy, and particularly when it's seen to clash with freedom of expression, and that's an ongoing battle. So I'm not sure that getting to uniformity is going to be necessarily possible, or certainly in any way easy. We haven't got there yet, and I think that's probably likely to be the position for quite some time.
And interestingly, you've just described the UK, Europe, and the USA. I mean, think about that in relation to China or in relation to Japan, two very different cultures. You think a lot about these questions. I think, David, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Yes, well, I mean, the US is an outlier, but as you say, China would be even more of an outlier, including on the public sector and what's appropriate for the state to do. I mean, if you go back to the 1990s and when the European Union made data protection mandatory in the mid-1990s, almost no country outside Europe had similar laws. So it was very much data protection is a European phenomenon. It's something Europe cares about. That's totally changed now. At least half the world, probably more now, has a data protection framework in place. But there is not just that there's heterogeneity in terms of what countries are aiming at. There's limited enforcement is the truth, and that might be because countries don't actually care in the way, or societies don't care in the way we kind of think they do in the law. But it might also be that, the internet is globalized, but in fact the system of law we have remains incredibly fragmented. And what we might be caught to some extent in a prisoner's dilemma, that it's in no one's interest, particularly in commercial interest, to be the country which actually enforces the law and enforces the protections against the large multinationals, because the large multinationals may well say, well, okay, we're off somewhere else. We're taking our profits out. So to some extent, it's a coordination problem. And we still don't have an international convention which seeks to regulate this area. We do have a Council of Europe convention, which dates back to 1981, and countries outside Europe, in Africa, in South America, I don't think yet in Asia, but there is interest. Japan has just got an adequacy decision from the European Union, so there is interest. In fact, there may be a country in Asia which has signed up. So we do have a Council of Europe convention which is seeking to coordinate, but it's very, very early days and it's very rudimentary in terms of its enforcement.
We have a very different question from a graduate of Sydney, Sussex. And it's quite an interesting point that a lot of data that we talk about as potentially being owned or emerging from a person actually emerges from interactions amongst people. The point's made that even, for example, a medical diagnosis is an expert opinion applied in relation to a patient. And the question is, who would appropriately own data in situations where much data is created by interaction? Kirsty, any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of looking at it from data specifically, probably that would be more within David's realm than mine. But I mean, obviously, in terms of interactions with privacy more generally, I mean, privacy, I mean, it can be involving obviously just one person solely, but there can be obviously multiple people involved in those situations. I mean, I think in the medical context, you've got a separation there between a sense of an opinion, a diagnosis, but of course it is about the patient, so to speak. So it only relates to one person, even if it involves more than one person in the actual diagnosis. But I'll hand over to David on the data protection aspect of it.
Go ahead, David.
Well, like many things, data protection has taken a very broad view, and relates to in European data protection would be, it could be that it's about the individual, it could be that it's designed to have an effect on the individual, or it could even be that it isn't designed, but it does in practice have an effect on a specific identifiable individual. Now, the medical is interesting because it would obviously be the personal data of both the doctor. It is about them in a way, it's their professional opinion, and it could impact them. Say it's being used to evaluate how good or bad they are at their job. It's clearly also probably satisfying all three of the nexuses or the relationships when it comes to the patient as well. I mean, this gets back to the fact that a system of data protection based primarily on control doesn't really work. It breaks down. And we're back to the fact that it isn't ownership. There may also be intellectual property things which have to coexist, like confidentiality or other forms of copyright protection. But data protection brings to the picture a certain set of interests and fundamental interests which need to be built in to the way that data is managed. That isn't ownership, but it is protection.
Thank you.
I think so.
Yes, go ahead.
From a human rights perspective as well. I mean, you do have situations perhaps where you have more than one person saying, well, it's my information. So the classic example would be where somebody wants to publish a story, which they say is about their life, but it obviously contains details of somebody else's life. And there you have privacy claims on each side, but one person wants to waive their right and the other person wants to uphold it. But you don't have to designate it as being owned by one person as such.
A very different type of question coming from a Magdalen graduate, suggesting that some data he's seen, I think it's a him, suggests that of the top 10 cities in the world with CCTV coverage, broadly. Most are in China. In fact, he would say all are in China except for London, which is in the top 10. Kirsty, is that something from a human rights perspective that we should be deeply worried about?
Well, I mean, obviously, we've had CCTV for some time, and this has been occasionally issues which have gone on this to the Human Rights Court. They've tended to take a very kind of lax approach, really, to CCTV itself. I mean, obviously, that's why we have such extensive CCTV. But where they have drawn the line has been in cases where certain uses have been made of the information which has been recorded. So, in particularly in one prominent case that went to the European Court of Human Rights, there was video footage which was taken by a CCTV camera and was then broadcast on the national news as part of a documentary demonstrating the effectiveness of CCTV. Now, in that case, the applicant objected. They didn't object, in fact, to the use of CCTV itself, because actually they had been saved by the use of CCTV because they were in a suicidal state and the emergency service had got to them in time. So they were actually quite grateful for the use of CCTV. But they weren't happy, obviously, at this being broadcast on the news and this footage being shown of them. So we do have some restrictions, but we certainly have, it is a good example of how we have rolled out a technology which has become ubiquitous without having really much in the way of safeguards.
Thank you. David, a different type of question entirely from a Pembroke grad in the United States, suggesting that governments are beginning to create penalties. You've been talking about enforcement for abuse of data and violation of data protection laws, but it's asserted that the actual penalties themselves are very slight in relation to the business opportunities that using and abusing data present. Is that a fair observation? Are fines too small for breaches of data protection law?
Well, it's partially true. I mean, I think it's true that in many parts of the world outside the European Union, penalties remain on the low side, even in principle, and that would even be in the case, say, in Canada, which I know you know a good deal about. But it isn't the case formally in Europe anymore. I mean, under the General Data Protection Regulation, which has been applying for about 2 years now, most or many of the most serious breaches and very large amounts of the breaches would attract 20 million, up to 20 million euro fines, or 4% of annual global turnover, if higher, which in the case of, say, Google and Facebook would run into the hundreds of millions. So, and there have, to be fair, been, I think the French Data Protection Authority recently did a fine Google, I think it was 50 million euros. So we are beginning to see that applied. But what I would say, coming back maybe in particular to the UK, is there really a commitment or a desire to see the law enforced? You know, the Information Commissioner in the UK has over 800 members of staff. It does now have significant resources. It has very significant powers to shut down processing, powers to audit processing, and powers in the case of violations, as I say, to fine up to these really stringent levels, and arguably an obligation in many cases to fine. And yet it has only issued one fine in the entire 2 years that the General Data Protection Regulation has been enforced. Now in Spain, still quite low, but 120 fines or so have been issued. So it gets back to what, in fact, is the desire. Is the desire to see this law enforced, or some law enforced, or is the desire to largely not enforce it and use other sort of more softer mechanisms to encourage, to maybe cajole, to promote best practice, but in fact to have an environment which doesn't tend to enforce things stringently? The GDPR would allow much more stringent enforcement.
I think we have time for one more question, and It's an interesting one because it's quite a stark contrast that's being drawn. It's very direct. From a Girton graduate here in the UK. Should I be more worried about giving my data to a tracing service run by a public authority, such as a local authority public health system, or run by a commercial entity? What would your advice be? Is there better structured regulation protection in one case or the other? Do you want to start, Kirsty?
Well, I mean, I think that probably depends on what your fear is. So, is your fear that your data is going to be exploited for commercial purposes, or is it, and therefore it's going to feed into various ways in which you're going to be targeted, or is your fear that your data is being handed over to the state and it's going to be used in some way which is discriminatory against you? So your perception of fear is going to very much depend on what your trust is in relation to each of those different types of institutions, and in different contexts your response therefore to that is going to differ.
What would you say, David?
Yes, and I would agree with that, and also say that it depends very much in what political system you're operating in. I mean, let's assume that you're operating here in Europe. I was going to say the European Union, but clearly I can't say that anymore. I think it would be fair to say that in Europe we've tended to see the state as something which we have common ownership with, and therefore the general data protection regulations, say, has mainly been focused, or significantly focused more on private sector processing. But that said, here in the UK, the regulator is often focused more on the public sector. A previous information commissioner talking about the surveillance society, but really talking about the surveillance state. So you might feel that, in fact, there's more concern and more rigor and more desire to take action against the state actor, and you might be more concerned that the private actor, even in relation to things like discrimination and unfair targeting, may be allowed to slip through the net. But that said, I mean, there are good and bad actors and good and bad practices across both of these sectors.
That's great. Thank you very, very much. I've allowed us to go a little bit over our time because we started a bit late, but we have reached the end of the session, and I want to thank everyone for really good questions, as always has been my experience with these Cambridge conversations. No surprise there. I'm sorry couldn't get to all of those questions, but I want to thank you, Kirsty, and David for really, I think, great conversation and discussion, which was really informative. I think it's been a great opening session for the 30th Alumni Festival, and there are many, many more fascinating sessions to come. I hope that all of you online will enjoy them. And if you are unable to attend some of them, and I'm sure you won't get to every one, do look at the YouTube channel where many of them will be posted for you to see at a later date. So thanks to all of you for joining us. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of the Alumni Festival. Goodbye, everyone.